Okay. Well, thank you everybody for coming today in the today's webinar. In today's webinar, we're going to have two presenters. I will briefly introduce both. First one is going to be like Professor Semu Moges. Professor Semu is a leading water source professional in Ethiopia who has been teaching courses at Arba Minch University and very recently at Addis Ababa University. I know currently he has moved to the US and affiliated to the Connecticut University. He is, you know, the regional and the national leading water professional in the country working on representing Ethiopia in various, forums, including the Nile as member of advisory committee members in the Nile negotiation. But he has also contributed quite substantially in the regional water resource management. Our second speaker is going to be Professor Woldeamlak. Professor Woldeamlak is a geographer and overall a natural resource expert, very well-established scientist at Addis Ababa University. He has worked with a number of projects in the region, taking quite a number of consultancy arrangement assignments for the World Bank, for the African Development Bank, and various other institutions. And he's also representing Ethiopia in the whole COP initiative. And at the country, he's the first person to go to in terms of any climate change related issues, both it for adaptation and also mitigation. So we'll be hearing from both on the impact of climate change on the water resource, on water security in the region, particularly in Ethiopia and in Eastern Africa. I think that will give us quite useful and accumulated knowledge and information on the state's challenge and probably the opportunities in terms of water resource management. So our first speaker is going to be Professor Semu. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tena, for your kind introduction. Yes, even though I'm away from the region, I'm still, my heart, my mind is mostly investing a lot in the region in terms of different water and climate change issues. So I would also like to thank you for giving me this opportunity. I would like, I heard there's a diverse group of audience. So as much as possible, I'll try to make my presentation as much as understandable and focus on very pertinent issues of the Nile. I will not go into detail, but I would be very happy to answer questions. So for the purpose of introduction, I think I have been introduced. I would start from a very big global perspective. You know, we always say climate change is generally a shift in the most important component of the weather, temperature, precipitation, evaporation, and so on and so forth. And we have to stress this century, climate change is mainly driven by human activities. Models have shown, and since industrial revolution, we have grown from a mere 200 million people to close to 8 billion. The sheer number of population by itself is an indication that there is a change going on the planet. So When we say a long-term shift, it can be in terms of long-term mean state, it can be in terms of long-term extreme conditions, it can be in terms of non-stationarity. So anything should be properly assessed in terms of, we cannot say, okay, if sometimes you can see the mean is not changing in the long term, we might miss the point that climate change is, the impact is not visible, but in different hydrological regimes, we can detect different climate change impact features. From global perspective, we have already, from observation, we have seen climate changes driven by greenhouse gas emissions over the last 200 years. Greenhouse emission, carbon dioxide, methane, and so on has drastically changed. And this cycle, the greenhouse emission is that drives the climate change, and this climate change is modeled at a global scale, and that's downscaled or downscaled into a regional and into a local model, so that we can understand the change in our areas in different parts of the region. So that's how we have a global system that's driven by ocean, land, and atmospheric interaction. And the impact at the global level is modulated by local conditions like altitude, like, land use change and the like. So we have, because I say this is driven by human activities, is that there is a solid found evidence that carbon dioxide has increased from since industrial revolution without abating. As you can see, this is a change. You can see carbon dioxide is increasing, nitrous oxide, all these gases that are important for climate change detectors are drastically increasing. And these gases are like a blanket that absorbs heat and doesn't allow heat escape from the Earth's surface. So it is a greenhouse gas that increases temperature, and the evidence shows from the temperature, as you can see, temperature anomalies shows increase consistently up to 2020. These are some of the indications how carbon dioxide concentration, methane, and others increased from the pre-industrial revolution, parts per million, to this is 379 when I started the first climate change impact model running myself. And now at this time, we have 420, so it's increasing unless we do, and carbon dioxide is 65% of the greenhouse gas on the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. So based on these evidences, there are different socioeconomic pathways that are used to project. There are different ways, as you can see, as unless we act on carbon greenhouse emission, we can end up having a huge concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as you can see, if we have close to 1,300 ppm concentration, there is a likely chance the temperature will rise above 3 degrees centigrade. If we can mitigate to what we are agreed at Paris Agreement, we can contain to 1.5 to 2 degrees. So these are scenarios based how the world would evolve in the future. If we act to our best interest, we can at least mitigate, but the inertia of climate change would obviously continue for some time. So how do we do for Blue Nile or for our region? We have a big global climate models with a large resolution, and then we can downscale this into regional areas, and then finally we can have included the hydrology, vegetation, and topography into local scale. So we have to downscale into our interest area to get the impact of climate change in the Nile, for example, or in the Blue Nile. So that's how we transfer the climate change impacts understand in our region. So as you know, this is a Nile basin. Nile basin is represented by from Egypt to Burundi, and these are the two main source areas of climate change. This is Ethiopian highlands, as you can see, this is high rainfall area, and this is South Sudan and the Equatorial. These are the main water resource area for Nile basin, especially the Blue Nile that contributes more than 85% of the water. The Nile in Ethiopia, not only the Blue Nile, the other. So this is the area where there is the source, the water source, and these are areas with high evaporation. As you can see, the region, the Nile region, continues from dominating from evaporation slowly into water source areas. So how does climate change impact the water source area, especially the Blue Nile area? That's where today's talk is. So Blue Nile is in Ethiopia. Most of you probably heard about it. And we have 14 subcatchments that usually we use in study. Why I try to present this is that how does it impact spatially also the Blue Nile in terms of scenarios. So climate change, we can detect climate change in different ways at local level. At a hydrological scale level, we can detect from precipitation, from runoff, evaporation, temperature, groundwater, and so on and so forth. We can also analyze on the basis of temporal scale, at annual scale, seasonal scale, extreme. We cannot understand climate change impacts by only taking in one feature of the hydrological cycle. So some features are visible from annual scale, some from seasonal scale, and the like. And changes could be trends, increasing or decreasing trends, sometimes non-stationarity, or sometimes variability that's explained by coefficient of variable or standard deviation. For example, this is the mean state, observed mean state of Addis Ababa rainfall. Conway has also did 100 years, I think, with Woldeamlak also. The mean state of rainfall is not properly, doesn't detect any climate change. As you can see, this is mean annual rainfall of Addis Ababa. These are different seasons. This is wet season, dry season, bulk season. But when I go with my students, what about the extreme condition? As you can see, the extreme condition in 2 stations in Addis Ababa, we took extreme events and try to see the anomalies. You can see extreme events are slightly increasing with a high degree of confidence. So we cannot get outright that the signature of climate change from the mean state. You can see this is Blue Nile. As you can see, this is upper Blue Nile with variable hydrology. This is the flow. The flow continue to be variable. And the interesting thing is that Blue Nile is highly variable. This is standard deviation. The variability increase. This is what worries me also. It's not the mean state of the Blue Nile that worries a lot of us. It is the variability of the Blue Nile flow and rainfall. So there are a lot of studies that have been done. I think you can browse in the internet. Most of the study, including IPCC, shows there is a likely increase of wetness in the eastern part of Africa, and this is translated into slight increase of runoff and the precipitation in the long-term sense. And this is what one of the MIT studies shows. There is there would be an increase in terms of storage, in terms of annual volume in the Blue Nile. As I told you, what worries most is that there is increased variability, which is the main feature of the Blue Nile, especially the rainfall variability that occurs at the current or wet season is the main issue, especially in the Ethiopian part of the Blue Nile, because Ethiopia is a rain-fed country, and the rain-fed countries rely mostly on the rainfall. So the rainfall variability would be a daunting challenge for Ethiopia or Blue Nile areas. Even though in the long-term sense, the storage or the flow increases. The second part of my presentation is sensitivity analysis. We did with my students a different sensitivity analysis. In the Nile Basin, the Ethiopian part of the Nile is highly sensitive. What does sensitivity mean? For a unit change of rainfall, the flow changes almost twice. You can see for 50% change in rainfall is close to 20% decrease. For also increase, you can see. So Blue Nile or most of Nile rivers in Ethiopia are highly sensitive to a unit change of temperature, or we have also checked temperature. And then you can go to Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria is close to half of, so because of the damping effects of the lakes and the swamps, it is less sensitive that. And the main Nile is mostly driven by Blue Nile because 80 to more than 80% of the Nile comes from Ethiopian highlands. So the Nile variability is driven by Ethiopian Nile variability. So sensitivity is one of important issues. If there is a slight change, there is a likely change in the flow twice. Yeah, this was what I tried to show on the, what about the watersheds, the watershed sensitivity climate. Ethiopia is, as you know, a rain-fed country, and due to change in the land use, due to change in the slope and the geomorphology, climate change impacts sensitivity spatially varies. For example, this is, you can see this part of Jema close to Addis Ababa, this area, Wollo, northern Wollo is highly sensitive to a unit change of rainfall. So this is, you know, from adaptation point of view, understanding the heterogeneity of sensitivity in the Blue Nile is very important, especially from rain-fed agriculture point of view. So this area close to Lake Tena area, we know it's a flat area. It's less variable, and also Little Anger area, we also know this is less. This is the central part is less variable, and the southern, southwestern, and southeastern part and northern part are highly sensitive to climate change as far as rain-fed condition, rain-fed is concerned. So this is important for adaptation. Probably Woldeamlak would touch on that. It would be also an input. We did it with one of my students some years ago. In the Blue Nile, I think it's also important what dominates the elasticity of climate change. We took all of these sub-catchments and small catchments. We have found out that climate change impact is dominated by precipitation in some sub-catchments, but in some sub-catchments, it's also highly dominated by potential evapotranspiration. The increase in temperature has more drastic impact or dominates climate change impact locally at some like in Chacha and some of the stations we have. So these are also some of important suggestions for adaptation, which probably will help local policymakers. Yeah, there are a lot of studies. As I said, I'm not going to dwell on that. I would answer questions, but what we can say about Blue Nile is that seasonal rainfall variability, especially in cramped or wet season, increases, and that would have a consequence in the upper Blue Nile, especially in the vast rain-fed agricultural areas. Blue Nile flow also is variable, but there is tendency of wetting, and this is also a good indication that if we can put storage on the cooler part of the Eastern Nile region, especially in Ethiopia, that also benefits the region. Another important remark is Blue Nile is highly sensitive for a small change in climate, and this transfers into the main Nile because Blue Nile is the main contributor to the Nile. As I said, southern and eastern Blue Nile watersheds are more vulnerable to climate change than the central and northern west, northern and eastern part of the Nile. Why I focus on the rainfall part of this is highly populated. We cannot only talk about the flow, we have to talk about the people that's packed in the Nile part of Ethiopia. It's highly rain-fed, it's highly degraded. So this is the area that's going to be affected enormously unless we do adaptation. And this adaptation should focus on arresting both variability at local scale. I think Woldeamlak would focus on that, and also vulnerabilities. Some of areas, highly mountainous areas, are highly vulnerable for a slight change of climate change. So in the Blue Nile, especially in the Ethiopian part, I think the variability aspect is more pronounced, and adaptation and policy making should focus on that area. Thank you very much. I think we can discuss more on question and answer session.
Thank you, Professor Semu. Yeah, I mean, you raised quite important issues. By the way, for the audience, I would like to bring to their attention that one of the reasons why we also do this, particularly climate change impact on the Nile Basin, is because of the issues that you mentioned. Bewket and Ermias are actually working seriously on, led by Professor Woldeamlak, are doing on the whole adaptation. Now, what I would suggest is, like, you can look into the pointers raised in the Q&A and the chat. Bewket would also help you in capturing those pointers. But let's have the presentation of Professor Woldeamlak first, and then we can generally proceed to the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the nice introduction. And my presentation is a follow-on to the previous one by Professor Semu, which is on the impacts of climate change by focusing on the Blue Nile and the impacts on water resources more broadly. So he has nicely covered the physical science base of climate change, and then covered also the specific impacts of the changing climate on water resources, and in particular, including the intra-basin differences in the impacts of climate change on the Blue Nile Basin. My presentation will simply be follow-on to this, as I said, and I'll be focusing on what has been done in terms of responses to the changing climate and its impact on water resources in Ethiopia. So it's titled Policy Responses to Climate Change Impacts on Water Resources. So the intention is to give you a more complete picture of the impacts and the responses from a public policy point of view. So I'll be covering this, and in one slide I'll be talking about water in the national economy of Ethiopia and climate change and water resources. And then I'll focus to policy responses to climate change in general and how water is considered in these major policy documents. I will not be covering all of them, and then I will focus on more relevant ones. And I will mention the CRG strategy and the climate resilience strategy for water and energy. And we have the climate resilience water safety plan, strategic framework and guidelines, a national adaptation plan, and we have a 10-year development plan. And we recently submitted an updated NDC's nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC process. And finally, a conclusion slide. The objective, as I said, is to overview the policy responses. So it's basically listing the policies we have as responses to the current and projected impacts of climate on water in particular. And I will not attempt at evaluating the implementation of policies or the policies themselves, but instead I'll just be mentioning them so that colleagues, you see how Ethiopia is endeavoring to respond to the challenge of climate change. So this is one of the most famous figures we have, both from the World Bank, but the first one, this one specifically by names of these two World Bank staff anyway. So that shows how Ethiopian economy and society is vulnerable to the variability. Dr. Semu was stressing on the importance of variabilities and reducing vulnerabilities to variability. So in this curve, we see correlation between rainfall fluctuations and fluctuations in GDP and agricultural GDP. Of course, agricultural GDP is a major contributor to the GDP. So no wonder that the two are strongly correlated. And then we see rainfall fluctuation has been accompanied by, fluctuations in the rainfall. So this obviously will not indicate causation. In the other graph, which is also by the World Bank, we see how variability affects poverty rates, poverty reduction efforts, in other words. So that is between 2003 and 2015. So by this time, there were 29 million poor people as defined by World Bank. And then with average rainfall, constant rainfall, mean rainfall, long-term mean, extending into this. So given population grows, the number of poor people would reach 40 million. And if one drought year occurs, they simulated the number of the poor would go to 45 million. And by modeling, introducing the variability, the historical variability into the model, they have shown that actually the number of poor would grow from 29 to 51. That clearly shows that variability costs Ethiopia much more than even the devastating droughts. So the droughts are these big events, but you see from the impact point of view, as also mentioned by Semu, variability is a bigger risk. So that is the impact. So that is how important variability is. And the climate change impact on water, on water constitutes a systemic risk, and it has economy-wide impacts because the impact of climate on water affects not only water security in the country, but also food security and energy security as well. So we rely on rainfall for energy, rainfall for food, rainfall for water. So climate impact on water is actually a systemic risk, and it propagates through the economy, and the impacts are economy-wide. So when we talk about climate impact on water, so basically this is a climate impact on the national economy and the national population at large. So what has been done by way of responding to climate change, as we'll see in the next slide, Ethiopia has an impressive portfolio of policy responses, and some are because of this national need for policies and programs, and others are actually driven by the international processes. So specifically, the UNFCCC, has been demanding countries to submit these policy documents and prepare and submit these. So quite a few of them have been developed because of these international drivers, but we also have very important documents out of a national, need and desire to respond to climate change. So what are considerations in these policy documents are? So in many of the documents, water is mentioned as a vulnerable sector. So in Ethiopia, I would say agriculture is most vulnerable, water is most vulnerable, energy is most vulnerable, and health is most vulnerable, and so on. So in many of these documents, water is listed as a vulnerable resource in itself. The sensitivity which was shown actually shows in the exposure of the water resource, and therefore it is vulnerable. And in some of the documents, water is mentioned as an adaptation, water for adaptation in other sectors, and others are the documents which are about adaptation for the water sector itself. So water is seen through these three perspectives: vulnerable sector itself, and for adaptation in the other sectors, and adaptation measures are also, there are also strategies for adaptation in the water sector itself. So this is the maze of national policies, policy documents we have in the country related to climate. And to quickly mention them, so you see, we ratified the UNFCCC convention, the framework convention, 94. And then the Ethiopian constitution mentions that citizens have the right to live clean environment, sustainable, safe environment, and so on. And then we submitted the first inventory of gases to UNFCCC. This is as demanded by the convention in 2001, and Ethiopia ratified the Kyoto Protocol in 2005. And as demanded by UNFCCC, so the National Adaptation Program of Action document was prepared in 2007. But then this was heavily criticized by local experts. And the government had to update it to a new document called Ethiopia Program of Adaptation on Climate Change, EPACC, in 2010. And then, as demanded by UNFCCC processes, a nationally appropriate mitigation action document was prepared in 2010. And this is a nationally driven process. The famous climate resilient green economy strategy was developed in 2011. But here again, there was this local criticism that this strategy focuses on the green economy component, on mitigation, whereas a national priority should be adaptation. And this led to the development of these other documents subsequently. There's a climate resilience strategy for agriculture and forestry in 2015, climate resilience strategy, energy, water and energy in 2015, and for transport 2015. And then the national communication was updated, the second one submitted in 2015. And in this, we submitted the INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions. This is also a UNFCCC process, 2015. And the GTP2, the CRGE plan, was more or less fully mainstreamed into all sectors. This is an integrative national development plan. And then health adaptation plan was prepared and published in 2017. Urban development housing resilience strategy in 2017. And we ratified, we signed this in 2015. So it became law, part of national law. And then automatically this converts intended intended nationally determined into nationally determined contributions. That is automatic upon ratification by Parliament of the agreements. And then a national adaptation plan, on the basis of all these resilience strategies and the green economy strategy of the CRG, an integrative national adaptation plan was developed in 2017 and finished actually in 2019 or so. And then a roadmap, implementation roadmap was immediately prepared. At first, mobilization was a mobilization strategy for the adaptation plan. This document was prepared. 10-year development plan was approved in 2020, so implementation begins from the 2021 to 2030. And then we submitted recently in 2021 an updated NDCs to the UNFCCC process. So you can see that we have so many of these strategy and policy documents in place to tackle the challenge of climate change. So to briefly go through the most important ones, as I said, the CRG strategy is the most important document, 4 pillars, as you can see, and that focuses on mitigation, improving agriculture, forestry, energy, and technologies. This is in the construction, urban, and transport sectors. So that is the focus is on the, you see, this is agriculture, this is forestry, this is energy, and this one is in the transport and construction industries in built-up areas. Right? So that is the focus of the green economy component of the strategy, and the strategy indeed is focused on reducing emissions. So the vision is a country to achieve middle income status by 2025. That will be climate resilient and less of emissions, and the challenge and the plan. So that is the green growth plan. And this is about the implementation of this. So that is a broad framework which provides, as I said, a framework document for the preparation of all resilience strategies, including for water. And the water and energy resilience strategy, which, as I said, is based on, you see that the mother document, Ethiopia climate resilient green economy, and this is a resilience for water and energy. 3 pillars, challenge, response, implementation. What it does in the challenge is assesses climate risks to the water sector, and of course the major water source areas are Blue Nile and Barokobo and in this western part of the country. And the response is about okay, I actually have the slide. So the challenge, these are the planning frameworks. So the planning assumptions are that there is increasing temperature, there is increasing rainfall variability, and there is a change in the seasonal rainfall pattern in some parts of the country. So that is the background information. This is a climate projection which has informed the development of this resilience strategy for water and energy. So look, this nicely follows Semu's presentation. So that is the month-to-month variability in temperature and in rainfall, year-to-year variability in rainfall and temperature, and long-term changes, projections to 2050 in temperature and also in rainfall. And there is a focus on the year-to-year variability throughout the document. So the strategy is quite consistent with the research evidence, which was presented by Semu, that variability is much more damaging than the long-term changes. So in the response, as you can see, there's a focus on, this is the water sector, that is the energy sector, and they have what they call poverty reduction component down here and the growth component over there. And the focus is on irrigation development and improving rain-fed agriculture and water demand management in here. So these are the 3 areas. So, focusing on irrigation agriculture, but also on rain-fed agriculture. 3.2 is on strengthening rain-fed agriculture, basically improving water productivity and rainwater management in agricultural lands. And WASH is here, accelerating access and enhancing self-supply and making these climate resilient. And these are cross-cutting data monitoring and so on, and deliveries about coordination mechanisms and finance and so on and so forth. So this is the planning matrix contained in the resilience strategy of water and energy. So on the cost of implementation, as you can see, this is a irrigated agriculture. So look, the focus of this is a water resilience strategy, but still focuses on irrigated agriculture because variability is much more significant and the impact is through the agriculture economy. But then I was actually impressed by this number. So you have the largest budget estimated for 2030 for power generation, and then the second one in biomass and off-grid are for energy, and then you see this is WASH, which has a very large component for its health, public health implications. Otherwise, this component is relatively small, and a total of this million, so less than a billion. The other policy document we have is climate resilient water safety strategic framework, and this very much focuses on water supply. So the safe and adequate drinking water, and the targets are referenced to health. So there are some compulsory targets, I think, which have been derived based on recommendations of WHO. So we have this national climate resilient water safety strategic framework and also implementation guidelines, which have been all prepared in 2015. And the purpose is guide development and implementation of water safety, called water safety plans. And that is enable provision of safe and adequate drinking water that meets these requirements. So this is a generic framework, and there are specific guidelines prepared for the urban and rural areas, and we'll see them. So very briefly, the safety strategic framework has these strategic objectives. As you can see, they are all relevant to climate change. This is sustainability of water supply systems, and this is a compulsory standard, which I mentioned, and water quality monitoring, climate resilient safety plan preparation, and capability of urban utilities and rural WASH committees, so strengthening their capability. So these are the 5 objectives, the strategic objectives of this water safety strategy framework document. And as you can see, climate resilience is, so that is highlighted up there in this policy document as well. So that shows at least a level of commitment that government is trying to tackle climate impacts on water supply too. So this is water safety plan for urban areas. See, that is urban utility managed piped drinking water supplies. So this is a tool, so that gives a step-by-step guidance. So how to develop, how to implement, how to monitor, how to review safety plans, aimed at protecting human health. But also, there is a strong climate component in all of this. So in this guideline, this document, so there are some steps and procedures on how climate risk assessment should be undertaken in water supply schemes from production to consumption. This is another separate document for rural areas. You see, that's for urban. This is for rural, based on the safety strategy framework document, and the same objective. So engage, empower, provide step-by-step guidance to WASH committees on how to manage risks, including current and future impact of climate change, and sustain water safety. So you see, So that is also the climate resilience component, which has been given this level of attention. And there are details in this guidelines document on how the risk assessment should be undertaken and how climate resilience will be integrated into the plans. Well, these are what just an example of what the specific tasks are. So involve communities, describe the supply, identify the risks and the hazards, and develop an improvement plan and monitoring plan, and then review. So it's a cycle, safety, continuous improvement. And so they have this detail in this guideline for the rural WASH committees to follow in providing, you see, climate resilient water supply to communities and community managed water sources. The National Adaptation Plan, so the vision is create climate change impact resilient development. So you see that's an integrative plan, but this also covers the water sector nicely. But this document is about, as you can see, the priorities, mainstreaming climate change. So it includes mainstreaming climate change into water infrastructure development, building long-term capacities of institutions. Then there's water is also included in here. Implementing effective and systems about finance and financing mechanisms. This is also about water. Research and the water sector is in here. Knowledge management systems also relevant to the water sector. So this is an integrative adaptation plan which cuts across sectors, but as we shall see, there are also sector-specific actions. So these are the sector-specific ones. Lists 18 adaptation options. They have the 5 implementation components and the options. So as you can see, this is agriculture and water. So now water suddenly moves out of energy and comes with agriculture. And here, improve agricultural productivity or water productivity in agriculture, and improving access to potable water, which components comes here. And even in natural resource management is relevant for water. This is on safeguarding landscapes and watersheds, and soil and water harvesting. This is about self-supply and so on. It's also part of these, and water retention mechanisms. So as you can see, these are all relevant options which will be implemented under the adaptation program, but are relevant to the water sector. Others are in these sectors, you see. So the plan finally for implementation purposes, the adaptation options are put under these various implementation components, as they call it. So water is key in many of these adaptation options, also for the other sectors. By the way, not just for like power, for instance. Water is important, and the cost of implementation is estimated as 6 billion per annum for this 15-year period. So the implementation roadmap now identifies what should be done, when, and by who. So that is a simple action plan, and the roadmap is prepared in 2020. So there you will see also the Ministry of Water and Energy, having been given some task. So that is also relevant to the water sector. And we have a new water policy document. This is draft. I'm not sure if this has been approved. Dr. Tena will tell us. I only know it as a draft stage, and this is to replace the 1999 water resource management policy. And it has 12 objectives, and one of them is ensure that water resources development and management contributes to climate resilient development. You see, now water is here as sort of an input, critical resource for climate resilient development. and climate change adaptation is mainstreamed in any water sector development and management undertakings. In the policy document, there are 6 what they called cross-cutting issues, and then there are 6 policies. And one is climate change mitigation and adaptation policy. So look, it's under cross-cutting issues, climate change mitigation and adaptation is given a separate section. So it's about what should be done in the water sector to contribute to the global mitigation effort and adaptation at local levels. And this lists 19 strategies. These are specific interventions of what needs to be done to adapt to and mitigate climate change in the water sector. So you see, climate change is fully integrated into this new policy document as well. The 10-year pillar has 10 strategic pillars. Sorry, 10-year development plan has 10 strategic pillars. And one of them is a resilient green economy and water resources development put under infrastructure development, and includes wash, irrigation, and river basin development. And in all of these, climate change is taken into account, and water resource development has to be resilient, wash has to be resilient, irrigation has to be resilient, and basin development planning should take into account climate risk. So that is how climate is considered in this new 10-year development plan called a pathway to prosperity. And finally, we have these updated nationally determined contributions, and which is submitted in very recently, actually in August or so, around end of 2021. And this list is 40 interventions. So basically expands the 18 adaptation options of the NAP into now more specific interventions, and 6 of them are specifically in the water sector. So you see, this is water sector, which is 6, that is water, and there is health, and this is agriculture. Even in agriculture, it's also about water, and then there's forestry, which has also implications on water, and in the rest, there is a wash component, and there is health. So that is the number of adaptation options by sector, and that is the legend here. So 6 of them are in water. Finally, in conclusions, you see, I have not attempted at evaluating the policies. So it's fair to say that policies and institutional arrangements are in place, by Ethiopia, making efforts to respond to climate change by way of adaptation and also contributing to mitigation. And then we have seen what has been done for the water sector. And the questions for research are, however, many more than this listing, which is very general. So one is to look at the policies themselves, because the policies have been informed by available evidence by the time of drafting them. And the specific strategies, the interventions, and they also they need to be evaluated, and the planning assumptions themselves, the projections, for instance, so need to be assessed if they are still relevant, given new information, new data, and new evidence base. The options, the interventions also need to be evaluated if they are relevant, if they are feasible, if they are effective, if they are efficient, if they are acceptable, and if they are not going to be maladaptive in the long term, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of work to be done in all of these practical side of it. And the implementation progress, we have all these policy and program documents, but the evaluation of the implementation progress has not followed the pace of the development of the documents themselves for various reasons. So I think this is also very important to take stock of what has worked and what has not, and how it can be improved. implementation and then the challenges in terms of technology, in terms of finance, in terms of institutional capacity at different levels, and the adoption of options at grassroots level. And these are also issues for further research. So our 1 hour is up, and I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you both for the sharing us very comprehensive information on the state and state of the climate-related challenge in relation to water resource, and also the efforts being made by the government in terms of developing the policy and development initiatives. Now, I know we are running against time, but let's if there are questions in the Q&A and also some in comments. My colleague Degefe has shared those questions to Professor Semu. So if you have very quickly reflect on those questions, then Professor Woldeamlak will get the opportunity also to look into the questions being raised.
Okay, Dr. Tena, thank you very much. I have some few questions that some audience want me to allude. One is, what are the drivers of sensitivity? I think the drivers of sensitivity, as we saw, is that the land use change on the ground and the topography, the relief behavior of features of the Blue Nile. Blue Nile is from start to the border to Ethiopia. It is highly slopey and also degraded land. All this contributes to high sensitivity of it's the ground features that dictate the sensitivity of Blue Nile vis-a-vis the White Nile. White Nile is a very flat area with heavy storage effects, damping effects. So the sensitivity of most of the White Nile is very low. So I think it is those factors that drive sensitivity. The bulk variability is difficult to arrest with models. I think, yeah, most of long-term projections does not arrest even the mean state because there are embedded variabilities, first order, second order, third order variabilities that the models cannot, especially second order variabilities and beyond. But however, it's very important to note that despite variabilities, despite uncertainties in the model, I think adaptation, especially in that part of the world, in Africa, where the continent contributes the least amount of greenhouse gas. Adaptation is a way forward, and adaptation would, in fact, it's not only adaptation, filling the development gaps by itself can constitute as an adaptation. Socioeconomic development gap is big in Africa. If we can fill that gap, and then we are enhancing resilience capacity of the community, we are also in a way adapting. So without going into the details of the bulk problem and the like, adaptation is a way forward for arresting those uncertainties and variabilities. And another question I was asked was Nile level impact climate change. Is it like Blue Nile? I think, yeah, the most of the models show that it's likely to become wet, so it will have the same effect. But when it's translated into flow, because of sensitivities, because of storage effects, evaporation and the like, the dominant component drives what would the flow looks like. But in general, there is a likely tendency of flow increasing in both and variability increasing in both. What variability means is extreme conditions might be extreme in both way, drought and floods. There is another interesting question, dam controversy. Is it says, I think is it, if I'm correct, needed to build large dams and what is the impact of climate change. I think we have to note that many nations have a huge number of dams. United States, we have more than 80,000 dams. In China, there are more than 60,000 dams. Most of the world have dams and they have survived yet. And in terms of climate modulation, my study earlier when I was in master's and with some research showed that these dams create micro ecosystem. For example, if you go to Lake Victoria, at the center of Lake Victoria, the rainfall activity is high. Lake Victoria is where 80% of rainfall for flow occurs, not on the, it is on the Lake Victoria. So massive dams can modulate climate change in terms of weighting. If you go to even a small lake like Lake Tena, if you have a record on the islands, you might detect more rainfall activity. So in a way, dams have effect of creating a microclimate because the more humidity equilibrium creates in that atmosphere, there is highly likely to capture the moisture-laden air that's coming from different areas. So I think dams are very important. Whether it's large dams or small dams, that's debatable. I like that to be debatable because it's not a large dams or small dams, but dams are very important for arresting both the dry and the wet condition and should be promoted. I saw adaptations. There are a lot of adaptation documents in Ethiopia since 2000. In Africa, you can see piles and piles of documents for adaptation. I think it is high time we have to go into a Marshall scale investment for adaptation. Every scientist should not, the models are no longer valid anymore. We have to go into adaptation exercise from now on. The whole of the wars and these social unrests are partly contributed from these variability effects. That's why in many countries, communities fight for land, fight for water. So I think adaptation is a way forward, and that has to be followed by a Marshall scale investment. My study, we did a PhD study for water energy for nexus. Ethiopia, to reach into a lower middle income country by 2030 requires $90 billion. By 2050, it requires more than $300 billion to only reach to what we call upper middle income economic level. So many things are at stake. Of course, uncertainties are also high. So if we can reconcile, reduce uncertainties that's going on in the country and advocate for Marshall scale, then that might be a way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Semu. Professor Wolde, yours, kind of brief.
Yes, I will be brief, and yeah, can you hear me? I have two questions forwarded to me. One is on why NAPA was replaced by EPACC, the National Adaptation Plan of Action by Ethiopian Program of Adaptation to Climate Change. So the criticism was that the NAPA was based on weak analysis of climate risks. And it was said it was project-based and discretized, and it did not specify which project or activity was to be implemented by which institution, and so on. And the EPACC tried to correct that one. So now there's more analysis on climate risks. So there's more evidence, more data. And instead of a project, it is now program. It's called a program of action, as not therefore project-based. And in the EPACC, as you can see in the document, there is this specification of what activity was to be implemented by which organization for instance. If one is related to water, and it says Ministry of Water. Related to health, that says Ministry of Water. So there are the specific sector ministries that are supposed to deliver the actions, you see. So that is how the NAPA was replaced by PACC. The second question was on the money. So how is 895 million to be mobilized? So as many of you know, now these the NDCs, which were initially about mitigation, now include adaptation activities. So in the NDCs, we have what are called conditional activities and unconditional interventions. The unconditional ones are the ones which will be funded from public sources, by the government, you see. So they will be implemented as integral part of national development plans. So they are unconditional ones. So they will be taken as no regrets development measures with climate benefits. So they are unconditional and so will be covered by the government, and of course with all possible support from development partners and other actors. The conditional ones are expected to be financed through international financing mechanisms, and these are interventions that are focused on mitigation with only indirect adaptation co-benefits. So that is how the money is expected to be mobilized.
Thank you, Walde. So I would just want to say thank you for both presenters, and if there are any questions, there is a possibility to directly write to the both presenters, either through the WLRC network or directly as well.